pleasure to introduce the speaker today. It's Bob Lubarsky, who will speak about Sigma 03 determinacy and friends.
Thank you, Juan. My understanding of this series is that it's supposed to be informal, not so much a presentation of accomplished results, but more open questions, things that you would like to do, things that you intend to do. So this is why what I'll be talking about today is mostly the work of other people. I guess I can kindly say that my contribution has been modest so far. My contribution, if any, is going to be pretty much some questions at the end. So let's see, shall I use the green chalk? I wonder how this works with the recording. Probably not the best idea. Sigma 03 determinacy. We all know. White. Oh, come on. This is a multicultural society here. Let's be PC. Does that work? Okay, at least for the title. Sigma 03 determinacy. I guess I better cool the racy jokes here. This will be part of the permanent record. So, okay. So yeah, what I'm going to be talking about is what do you actually have to do in order to build a winning strategy for either player for such a game here. So, we know that ZF proves that there are winning strategies. So in particular, there are going to be winning strategies in L. So how far up in L do you have to go? What order do you have to go in order to get up to see winning strategies? So let me approach this very slowly over here. So sigma 03 set, and so if A is sigma 03, so we'll write A as the union, some countable union of pi 02 sets. So player 1, we're going to, here this is notation GAT. When we begin, T is full bare space, there are no restrictions. But as we go on, one player is going to decide on some kind of strategy or quasi-strategy. They're going to limit their choices. And then we're going to say, well, if player 1 limits their choices to T, then how does player 2 react? So you can think of this as omega to the omega, full bare space to start with. So we're going to focus on player 2. What does player 2 have to do, or what's player 2's meta strategy going to be in order to try to find a strategy? Well, player 2 is trying to get out of A. Player 1 gets into A. So player 2 would like the following, would like a tree T0. So presumably player 1 does not already have a winning strategy for T, because if we did, it'd be over. So what does player 2 want? So some sub-strategy, a quasi-strategy, such that the paths through the strategy do not meet B0 at all. So this is progress. If player 2 can avoid B0, it's a start. Ultimately, player 2 is to avoid all the B's. This is a start. And we would also like for T0 not to be a win for player 1. Or let's say 1 has no strategy, has no winning strategy for T0. Okay, so suppose that we're in an L alpha where player 2 can arrange this. Now, if we can do this, then what's special about B0? Well, nothing. B0 is a pi 02 set, just like B1 and B2. So then, using this fact over here, we could iterate. Well, player 2 could iterate this. And that is find a T1, which is a subset of T0. T1 misses all of B1, and 1 has no winning strategy for T1. if you can do this, then you can do this. It's the same kind of step. So you would then end up getting this shrinking set of quasi-strategies for 2. And then if you, let's see, what would happen if we took the intersection of all of these things? Wouldn't that be a good strategy for 2? Because then we will have missed B0. Because of this, we're missing B0. And now because of this, we're missing B1 and so on down the line. So any path through this strategy would miss all the B's, and that would be a win for player 2. Convinced? Anybody see the problem? Well, the problem, of course, is that if you're in bare space, this might be player 2's possible moves. So T0 says, don't do this one. And T1 says, don't do this one. And T2 says, don't do this one. And maybe at every finite step along the way, player 2 has a reasonable move as to where to go. But once you take the intersection of all of these things, there's nothing for player 2 to do. So this isn't going to work alone. This is why what we need is what's called a fusion trick. We need some kind of fusion strategy here. So this would mean that we can start with T, this is T, and you can shrink the whole thing to T0. So this is what T0 looks like. Player 1 goes first, and player 2 cannot restrict player 1's moves. Now, perhaps of all the omega many moves that player 2 had available to begin with in T, certain ones were eliminated. Player 2 now has a restricted set of moves in T0, whether player 1 plays 0 or 1 or 2, and so on. So because of T0, maybe player 2 has just these 3 options that are left. To go to T1, what you would then do is consider the tree from here. You'd want to preserve this node, and preserve this node, you preserve all the nodes on this level, and for T1, you would just take the restriction from here. So when you do T1, okay, you can't restrict player 1's moves, but because of T1, there are only these moves that are still left in T1, and now when you build T2, you start by looking at this tree and this tree and this tree, and you preserve all the nodes on this level. And so when you take this sort of, it's kind of like a diagonal intersection, but it's really the intersection of all the trees, then you still have an option at every level. Okay, so this is going to be the plan of action. We're going to want a fusion sequence. Okay, now what makes us think that we can actually build such a thing? What makes us think that if you start with a tree for which 1 does not have a winning strategy, that you can shrink and avoid a pi 0, 2 set and maintain that 1 still doesn't have a winning strategy? Well, that's given by the following lemma. If T is in L alpha, and L alpha is a sigma 2 substructure of L beta, then we can do exactly this. Then either one, there is such a T0, there is a T0 in L alpha, which does exactly what we want. T0 is a subset of T. T0 misses B. And 1 does not have a winning strategy for T0 in L alpha. It's very important where these strategies live. So either we can do what we want, or the other possibility is 1 has a winning strategy for our starting game in, let me say, L beta plus omega. It could even be a little bit lower than that. Maybe it's definable over L beta, but that level of detail just doesn't matter. So either you can get a winning strategy for 2 down in this bottom structure already, or you can very quickly over here get a winning strategy for 1. Okay, so this incidentally is where all the work is. I'm not going to prove this, I'm not going to say a word about this. This is where the hard work is. So how can we use that fact then to build the fusion sequence? Wouldn't it be nice if we could build the fusion sequence that we need in L alpha? Would this be enough? So according to this idea, go up to the first L alpha that has a sigma 2 elementary extension, and maybe we can do the fusion there. Okay, let's see what happens. So here's T. T does what it does. We shrink.
Why does that, is that enough? I mean, if 2 denies one a strategy in L alpha, why does that deny the strategy, period? I'm confused about the difference between a strategy belonging to L alpha and a strategy in L beta plus omega.
We don't have a winning, I'm not sure I understand your question. We don't have a winning strategy for 2 here yet. This is just a good start.
I guess I'm wondering why it's a good start.
Well, because we've missed B0.
But maybe one has a strategy outside.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Maybe one has a strategy outside of L alpha.
Well, if we can get a strategy, if we can stay in L alpha and avoid B0 and avoid, this is absolute. This statement is absolute. If player 2 sticks to T0, then no way are we going to end up in B0. If we could build a fusion sequence in L alpha, just keep iterating this, then avoid B1, avoid B2, then in the end, you avoid all of A. Player 2 wants to avoid A, which means avoid all the BNs. So if we can find one set, be it L alpha or maybe something more powerful than this, where step by step we can avoid each BN, that would be a winning strategy for player 2.
I think what John's worried about is that the induction hypothesis and the way you use it don't seem to line up. In player 1, you start, so you build T0 because otherwise player 1, let's say, you build T0 so that player 1 doesn't have a winning strategy in L alpha. But now you've got your T0 and you want to build T1, and player 1 might have a winning strategy in L beta plus omega, and
Which
then
is
the next step,
exactly the problem. I didn't say this is going to work. I'm just, we're getting it slowly here. So, okay, so here's T0. So we've taken care of B0, okay. Now if you want to do the fusion strategy, then what you would do is say, okay, let's look at this tree down here. If we were lucky enough that when applying this same lemma to this tree, if we were lucky enough still to be in case 1, then we would just refine this, and this tree also, and all the other ones that are here. If we could refine all of them, each one to miss B1, that would be progress. But maybe in that case, one has a winning strategy for this tree in L beta plus omega. That's really going to mess things up. Because you can't just say that one has, see, that doesn't give a winning strategy for one in the entire game. You might think, okay, well, 1 should play here, and if player 2 goes here, then I'll use the winning strategy that I just built. But that was a winning strategy starting from T0. Maybe if player 2 had picked a different T0 is not unique, plenty of T0s, maybe if player 2 had picked a cleverer T0, then player 2 could have pushed this through. So things are not lining up just yet. We're gonna have to do a little bit more So what will work is if we, let me write down that this does not iterate because of the fusion sequence. So what if we had the following? What if, in addition, we had that L alpha were a sigma 1 substructure of L beta double plus, where I mean by this the second admissible past L beta. Why two admissibles? Because it's quite enough to decide in an absolute manner whether you have what you have is a winning strategy or not. If you look at a potential winning strategy, if it's still a winning strategy definably over the next admissible, but this is good enough. If it's still a winning strategy 2 admissibles later, then it's a winning strategy in V. So if we were in this situation, let me draw it like this. Here's alpha, here's beta. So we get sigma 2 elementarity there. And if you go a little bit past beta, and you have sigma 1 elementarity, then we could argue as follows. When we start at t0 at t, look, if one has a winning strategy, we're done already. Okay, we are not partisan here. Whichever side has a winning strategy, good enough for us. If one does not have a winning strategy with t, then without loss of generality, throw away any position in t which would be a winning strategy for one. That is, if it's player 2's turn at this point, and player 2 has these choices as to what to do next, if this were a winning strategy for 1 from this point, then it doesn't hurt 2, 2 just goes someplace else. But then you think, well, 2 is never going to move here, why is it even in the tree? So first thing you want to do is get rid of all nodes that are wins for player 1. So if 1 does not have a winning strategy for t in L alpha, without loss of generality, 1 does not have a winning strategy for or at any node in the tree. Okay, so
At this stage, you're essentially building in one statement the proof of open determinacy, right? This last thing you wrote by itself is how you prove open determinacy.
okay. And I also jumped over how you prove pi 0 to determinacy. Couple of
Sort of
lines.
jump over the pi side to the sigma side.
So, okay, so what are we going to do? Let's see. So what happens with this case over here? I claim this case will never happen. How come? Because if 1 had a winning strategy over here, well, that's well within L beta double plus. That's a sigma 1 statement. So even at any node, I'm just looking at a node in the tree. So if we were in this case, it's a sigma 1 statement true when L beta double plus would reflect down by the sigma 1 elementarity to L alpha, and so that node wouldn't have been in the tree in the first place. So that's the argument that we're never going to be in case 2. By sigma 1 elementarity, we are never in case 2.
Okay, I'm
So
confused.
now we can do the induction. Yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm still confused. So as you go on iterating, you're going to be applying this lemma. When you build t sub n plus 1, t sub n is going to be playing the role of t.
Yes.
So that means to avoid the second case, you have to sort of, every time you build a new t sub n, rerun that argument to erase any stupid nodes from it.
Mhm.
Okay, so you're not just doing this once for t, you're doing it at every step of the induction.
Mhm.
Okay.
That's it. So, is Is everybody okay with this? Because I claim I have proven that we have winning strategies in this setting.
Or you can prove the lemma?
No, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm not going to prove the lemma. Nope.
Can you just go once more over the thing? Why do you have any knots left at the end?
Because we're doing a fusion sequence here. So when I have T0, suppose this is T0 here. Then because none of these nodes, no node in T0, once again, if there are winning nodes in T0 for player 1, throw them out. So without loss of generality, then player 1 has no winning node anywhere here. So when I go from T0 to T1, I'm not going to look at the whole tree. I'm going to take a subtree of, I'm just going to work on this tree. So for sure, I'm not going to lose this node, I'm not going to lose this node, and I'm not going to lose this node. And similarly for T2 and T3 and so on, so these nodes are going to stay forever, as will this node and this node. All of the nodes on this level of T0 will stay forever. So when I'm looking at T1, and what does T1 look like? T1 looks like this. All of these nodes will be preserved from T1 on. This is the benefit, the nature of the fusion sequence. And so this is why you get a winning strategy in the end.
See, there's also an implicit use of a little bit of absoluteness here. Whenever you talk about one does not have a winning strategy or does have a winning strategy in some level of L, like L alpha or L beta plus omega, you don't have to say winning against what plays at player 2. If it wins against plays in the same L alpha or whatever, then it wins against everything because that's a pi 1-1 statement, right?
I'm not
I think
quite sure I
that's
follow
me.
that. At stage n, we're talking about this game.
Let's
Tn
just
is in,
look at the very beginning. When you, it's not even iterate yet. Look at the lemma.
okay,
So the punchline in case 1 is that, among other things, 1 does not have a winning strategy in L alpha.
oh, yes.
I can interpret that as meaning he has no winning strategy if player 2 is playing in L alpha, or I could interpret it as meaning he has no winning strategy if player 2 is allowed to use 0 sharp and whatever else he can dream up. And the point is that it doesn't matter how I interpret it, it's coming out the same anyway.
That's right. As I mentioned before without writing it down, in order to see whether a potential strategy really is a winning strategy, you have to look at the next admissible ordinal, or look definably over the next admissible ordinal. And then it's absolute, because it is pi 1. You are talking about finding paths through trees, whether there's an infinite path or not. It comes down to well-foundedness. Well-foundedness is absolute, and you can check well-foundedness by looking over the next admissible. And L alpha, implicitly L alpha is a limit of, it's an admissible limit of admissibles. If you're going to have this happening, there's a certain reasonable closure on L alpha. So it's an admissible limit of admissibles, and therefore whether something is a winning strategy or not is absolute. To build a winning strategy is another matter, but given a potential strategy, whether it is a winning strategy is absolute. Okay, this is all fairly well established. This is older stuff. The really neat stuff is what I'm about to show now, and I can credit Phil Welch for this, because this is just such a great argument. So, okay, this was overkill. This sigma 1 elementarity there, that's overkill. What we want to do, it follows from this, that winning strategies show up at latest by the least alpha where you have this configuration. But we can actually do better than that. This is not tight. So how can we refine this argument? Let me get a little bigger picture over here. So suppose we have alpha and beta, which are get sigma 2 elementarity there. Let me call them alpha 0 and beta 0. And we have alpha 1 and beta 1 nested inside, where we also have sigma 2 elementarity. Then we could run this argument as follows here. See, if we take t in L alpha 0, I can't just ignore this and work here, because in order to eliminate case 2, then if 1 had a winning strategy over L beta 0, I can't reflect it down here. But look, t is in L alpha 0, therefore t is in L alpha 1. Alpha 1 is bigger than alpha 0. So if I run this argument looking at this, well, if 1 had a winning strategy, it would be definable or appear shortly after L beta 1. And now I could use the sigma 2, well, I need a sigma 1 reflection really, but I have sigma 2 reflection to reflect that back down to L alpha 0. And that would be the contradiction because of case 2. Remember, I'm starting with a tree where 1 has no winning strategy at any node. So if we were in case 2 looking at this inner pair, I could still use a sigma 1 reflection to reflect a possible winning strategy down here, and that would be a contradiction. So that's going to be the argument I'm going to use to show that I'm always in case 1. But remember, I did this argument working with this alpha 1, beta 1 pair. So all that's going to get me is that T1 is in L alpha 1. Did I say T1? I meant T0. All that gets me is that T0 is in L alpha 1. So if I want to iterate the argument, see, looking at this, I need a nested pair. So to get T1, I would need to have alpha 2 and beta 2 like this, also with sigma 2 elementarity. T0 is now a member of this. You just repeat the same kind of argument, which would get me a T1 right here. Now, if I want to build a T2 from that, I would need yet another nesting. And if you do this infinitely often, just omega many times, then you could build your winning strategy for 2 that way.
You could build many things out of it.
I'm sorry?
You could build many things out of it.
Yeah, well, what's wrong with this?
The alphas look good.
The alphas are very good, yeah.
Well, you can laugh, but the thing is, this works. This really does work. How does it work? You have to live in a non-standard model. And if you do that, then this works perfectly. So let's take an ordinal here. I'll call it gamma. It places, Phil calls it beta 0, but it's a little late to call it beta 0 now, so it's just going to have to be gamma. Gamma is a standard ordinal, and we want gamma to be the least ordinal such that there is a non-standard model with standard part gamma. Is that just coherent? Am I using gamma to define gamma? I think you know what I mean. With standard part gamma, standard ordinal gamma, and such a configuration. That is, there is an increasing omega sequence with limit gamma, and a decreasing omega sequence through the non-standard part, where we have this nested sigma 2 elementarity all along the way. It's not that hard to show that there is such a thing. It's less than the other configuration that I had, where you had alpha and beta sigma 2 and then a sigma 1 elementarity on top of it. That's bigger than this. You can find a smaller gamma than that alpha where you have exactly this configuration. So now, going back and forth between working in the model and working out of the model, you can actually do this fusion sequence. Because you see, the model doesn't need to know that you've picked out this double omega sequence beforehand. You just run the argument externally using this configuration, and you show, oh, the T's that I want show up all in the standard part. And now at L gamma, I mean, L gamma doesn't see this non-standard model. But in L gamma, you can say, well, pick out the least T0 which works, which does everything I want it to do. It doesn't matter how to, well, yeah, it does matter how definable it is. It doesn't really matter how definable it is. It is definable. You can pick out the least T0, and then you extend that to the least T1, which does everything I want it to do. And this is all definable over L gamma. L gamma doesn't know where these things came from. Okay? L gamma can't see these non-standard ordinals and do this construction. But we know externally from having worked in V that these trees do exist there. And so definably over L gamma, you can pick the least T's that have the properties that you want, and then you fuse them together definably over L gamma. And so this is enough to get you winning strategies. What I haven't argued for here is that this is exactly what you need to get winning strategies. The other half of the argument would be that if you picked any smaller ordinal, then you wouldn't get winning strategies definable over that smaller ordinal. So in fact, let me briefly tell you how to do this. There is one sigma 03 definable game, which you can show with a bit of work, that any winning strategy for that game does not show up until definably over L gamma. And what would that game be? Well, player 2 is required to build a non-standard model of exactly this configuration. And player 1 is supposed to try to show that the alleged standard part of that non-standard configuration is itself non-standard. That is, you can get something that looks like this with standard part omega 1 ck. Okay, but that would be sort of a false model of L gamma. So what player 1's task is to find an infinite descending sequence through what player 2 is claiming to be the standard ordinals of this funny model. So player 2 has a winning strategy because player 2 can just play the truth. Player 2 can play this model over here. But is there perhaps a cleverer thing that player 2 can do? No, because if player 2 were to lie and to play a model that looks like this with a smaller standard part than gamma, then player 1 could figure that out and produce the infinite descending sequence. So in order to make sure that player 1 doesn't win, player 2 has to play the truth. And clearly, if you're going to play a model that looks like this, that's with standard part gamma, that doesn't show up until definably over L gamma.
So does player 2 become the pi 0 3 player in your
Yes.
latest?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And
Yeah.
does it-
The requirements on player 2, it's actually just pi 0 2, as it turns out.
So the sigma 03 player always has strategies strictly before gamma, if he has one at all?
Yes.
And
Yeah, so that's an
where do the pi
interesting-
03 players?
That's an interesting thing about this over here. Where do strategies show up? Well, if you were to take, what should I call it? Take the least ordinal, which is a sigma 1 substructure of L gamma. All winning strategies for player 1, the sigma 03 player, show up by here. No new winning strategies show up in this interval. And for those sigma 03 games for which player 2 has a strategy, look, there are dumb sigma 03 games that player 2 can win very easily down here. But for those sigma 03 games for which player 2 does not have a winning strategy here, they are definable over L gamma. It's kind of an unusual thing. My experience with set theory and computability theory is you go up to the least ordinal where everything exists that you want, and that's not the natural stopping place here. Everything that exists by here exists way down low, and then there are a few other things that are just definable over this point. So since this is supposed to be a talk about future prospects, let me ask a couple of questions at this point. How can we time gamma. This is a bit of an unusual characterization of an ordinal, the least ordinal where some non-standard model of a certain type exists. I haven't seen any other characterization of an ordinal that way. So I like it, but it's a bit of an unusual way to describe something. It's a natural thing to look at. There have got to be other descriptions. For instance, the first place where sigma 0, 3 determinacy is true. Okay, that's another description. That's the point of this. There is another description that Philip again just figured out just recently. It turns out that gamma is also the freezing point for feedback infinite time Turing machines. So, infinite time Turing machines, you have a Turing machine, regular Turing machine, but it can run for a transfinite amount of time. There's a notion of what you do at a limit, what this Turing machine does at a limit stage. So it's an infinite time Turing machine. Feedback, if you happen to have been here during the British Logic Colloquium, I spoke a bit about feedback. What this is it's a certain oracle where the oracle contains the convergence and divergence information about programs that call that same oracle. So there's a bit of self-reference there. The oracle contains all the information about programs that are calling itself. So if you take these infinite time Turing machines and you throw in an oracle, and the oracle that you pick is the feedback oracle, then the question is, well, what does that compute? It's not that big a surprise you get something like this, because as Philip once again figured out, with regular ITTMs, what you can compute there is exactly the least ordinal where you have sigma 2 elementarity. To be a little coarse about it, this is what regular ITTMs will do for you. So a feedback ITTM, you figure the closure property would be a super version of sigma 2 elementarity. And as it turns out, you get the same picture over here. That is, with any sort of feedback computability, there are two basic things that can happen. Either the computation halts or diverges, comes down to pretty much the same thing, or the computation freezes. Well, any halting feedback ITTM computation halts down here, and any freezing FITTM computation freezes, well, either at some stage beneath delta or freezes at gamma. And Philip showed how you can program these machines to either compute winning strategies for player 1 or to try to compute winning strategies for player 2 and die trying, meaning that they freeze at stage delta. They've computed these various TNs along the way, but couldn't make that last step to fuse them together. It just dies at the end. So, okay, we now have three different characterizations for this ordinal gamma. There's got to be more. In particular, I would expect that there are some sort of inductive fixed point definitions of gamma that are available. If you look at the strategies for building, the theorems for building strategies for sigma 0,1 games and sigma 0,2 games, it's very much based on least fixed points of some sort of inductive operation. So I would guess that there would be a least fixed point definition of gamma somehow or other. Another way that you might think of defining gamma is in terms of reflection properties. I mean, we do have reflection properties showing up here, but what about not in a non-standard model, just in the standard L gamma? You know, it's beneath sigma 3 reflection, but some sort of super duper sigma 2 limit sigma 2 reflection. I don't know. I mean, Philip's thought about it, I've thought about it. We haven't really gotten anywhere with that. it would be nice to find some characterization of L gamma using reflection. Okay, so if I can pause in case somebody wants to ask a question. I'll switch color, how's that? To white, don't worry. So, an extension of this I would like to talk about. There's been some recent work by Montalban and Shore in which they talk about, I'll use their notation here, M pi 0 3 games. They're talking about Boolean combinations of sigma 0 3 games, which will give you pi 0 3 games as well as more than that. This gets you between sigma 0 3 and sigma 0 4. So there's a gradation there. In fact, delta 0 4 games are the union over ordinal omega 1 many omega 1 size or any countable Boolean combination of sigma or pi 0 3 games. In this case, M is finite. So their setup here is as follows. They have A, which is given by pi 0 3 sets, which without loss of generality are nested. Until we get to the end, which they always take to be the empty set. And what is this set A? Well, it's A0 minus A1 minus A2, where we're parenthesizing it to the left. Well, and then we could put AM at the end if you want, not that that makes a difference. So this is just a particularly convenient way to phrase what we mean by Boolean combinations of these things. So one of our sigma 0 1 games corresponds to M equal 1. So sigma 0 3 game is the same thing as M equals 1, because if M is 1, then you just have a pi 0 3 set and then the empty set, and when you take the set difference, there's nothing going on. So this switches the roles of players 1 and 2, but other than that, it's the same. So what did they show? They showed, there's all sorts of, proof theoretic and reverse math ways that they phrase this, but just let me get to one of the things that they showed phrased in the kind of stuff that I'm doing over here. The least model L, I'll call it L alpha M of M pi 0 3 determinacy is between the least sigma M plus 1 admissible ordinal and sigma M plus 1 non-projectable. Okay, let's see what this says for the case that I've been discussing so far when M is 1. When M is 1, as I said, it's just regular sigma 0 3 determinacy. So this would be saying that our ordinal gamma is between the least sigma 2 admissible and the least sigma 2 non-projectable. So if we have, let me call it delta, if delta is sigma 2 non-projectable, one way of understanding this is that L delta is a limit of sigma 2 elementary substructures. So here's delta 0 and delta 1. And all of to elementary substructures of L delta. So clearly this property here, or maybe I should say it's not hard to show, that if you have a non-projectable, then that's a stronger property than what we have over here. You could build, just take something with a non-standard model with standard part delta, and you get something like this. And it's way more, this is way more than you need to get this. So this is beneath the first non-projectable. At the same time, to be sigma 2 admissible, well, if you, what can I say? L gamma is sigma 2 admissible, and for that matter, all of these alphas down here are also sigma 2 admissible. If you're a sigma 2 elementary substructure of something, that will get these to be sigma 2 admissible. So when I first learned this kind of set theory, this level of higher recursion theory it was called at the time, to me the landscape looked like, well, sigma 1 admissible, sigma 1 non-projectable, sigma 2 admissible, sigma 2 non-projectable, and so on down the line. I was unaware of anything of any interest happening between those steps. Well, here's something that's happening between those steps. I even say here. It's strictly between these things here. Strictly between the first admissible and the appropriate level, and then the first non-projectable. So my question is, could we pin it down more than that? I would like an exact characterization of where these winning strategies show up. Questions? Does anybody have a suggestion? Is any property sort of a naive suggestion is fine. Anybody care to speculate as to what the property would be? Well, I took a shot at it. I figured the most straightforward generalization of this. What I first guessed would happen would be, instead of sigma 2 over here, we would have this nesting, what should that be? Sigma n plus 1. That's what I thought this was going to be. Let me write this down as a question. How can we characterize where winning strategies for M pi 0 3 games appear? So that was my guess for where they would appear, but I don't mind saying that since this is informal, Benedict, who's here at the moment, but has emphasized that this is supposed to be informal here. So I don't mind speculating aloud in public. I was thinking about this last night, fully expecting to get that picture I just erased, but I decided it's more likely to be something else. I decided the configuration which will do this is you have m plus 1 elementarity on the outside, and then one level in is sigma m elementarity, and inside that is sigma m minus 1 elementarity, and it keeps going down until you get to sigma 2 elementarity, and then the rest of the omega sequence continues with sigma 2 elementarity. I think that's what it's going to be. Now, I haven't seen any configuration like this before, perhaps somebody here has. So if this reminds you of something else you've seen, I'd be interested in hearing about it. For that matter, if you have any other questions, I'd be hearing about them also, because I think there's lots of interesting stuff going on here. And this is a rather modest list of questions, so if there's anything else that occurs to you, please bring it up. I'd be very happy to know.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments?
Because so one way I like to think of it as using freezing point for feedback ITTMs is you can give a presentation of this that makes it look rather like the kind of generalized recursion in finite types that Kleene did in the early 60s. So one could think of a generalization presentation in terms of an equational calculus where you've got an eventual jump operator which corresponds to these ITTMs, just as Kleene had an ordinary jump operator. Turing machines, one would have convergent computation, would have a well-founded computation tree, and so for Kleene, what he was getting was that a complete set of indices for the halting problem for such situation was a complete pi-1 set. So this is a complete G sigma 0 1 set of integers. If you do the same kind of presentation here, you just lift everything up from sigma 0 1 to sigma 0 3, and you do a higher type recursion whose eventual jump operator corresponding to these IGTMs. So then what you get is, for this kind of recursion, the halting problem is a complete set of indices for the halting problem there is just recursively isomorphic to a complete G sigma 0 3 set. So you can make the picture look exactly the same. I've never presented in terms of this kind of higher type recursion. Another characterization of this halting set or the complete G sigma 0 3 set is it's just the sigma 1 theory of this L delta, the smallest delta that's a sigma 1 elementary substructure of the L gamma. And that corresponds again to saying that the complete pi 1 1 set is just the sigma 1 theory of n omega 1 ck. So again, there's another correspondence. So another comment is Sherwood Hackman has just put up on the archive actually a solution to one of the questions you were asking about is there a monotone inductive definition correspondence to define this gamma. So he shows that if you assume kp plus sigma 0 3 determinacy, again it's this nesting ordinal, L gamma then is a model of pi 1 2 monotone induction. So this is just the next level up from sigma 0 2 determinacy, the least result of Solovay, where the least level where strategies for player 1 occur in sigma 0 2 games is the ordinal of sigma 1 1 monotone induction. So now the least level where strategies for player 2 occur in sigma 0 3 games is the first ordinal pi 1 2 monotone induction.
That would be a very nice result.
That's a more sort of traditional way
Yeah.
of characterizing such a gamma.
Yeah, I hadn't looked, and I asked the question about inductive definitions, but I hadn't looked into the literature about what was known and whatnot. A couple of decades ago, this was a field of active research to find closure points for different kinds of inductive definitions, and I just hadn't checked the state of the art.
This is very recent, the last couple of days.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. Any other question or comment? Peter?
If one looks at such a least model of some determinacy, can one see rather directly from the determinacy property that this must be a limit ordinal, a well-closed ordinal in certain senses or so? I mean, is that ordinal should be closed under ordinal addition or something like that? Can you prove that from the determinacy? Direct?
Oh. That's got to be something simple. I think I'd be hard pressed to do that on the spot. I mean, if you have any natural collection of games, the games have to be closed under well, what about if a winning strategy is, so you have 2 sigma 0 n games for some fixed n. So consider the game, well, first play this first game and then play the second game. So wouldn't that correspond to closure under addition? addition of the number of steps needed to complete it, but where the strategies would show up.
But you've got a gap here, so it's not going to be more subtle, right?
Oh, well,
Because
yeah,
the
but
one side strategies are all appearing low down, and then the other side strategies are all appearing.
yeah, but that's only like if sigma 0, 3 and then pi 0. Yeah, sure, if player one had, if one of the players had the winning strategy for both of them, then that would be a lot tamer. I don't know, is it easy to see that, I mean, you figure it's gotta be, at least it's some admissible ordinal, but is it easy to see that it's gotta be closed under addition? I don't know, I'm gonna have to punt on that. Well, look, I mean, strategies for sigma 0, 1 games show up co-finally through omega 1 ck. So any other higher level of determinacy would be closed under doing sigma 0, 1 like things. And so the argument that sigma 0, 1 gets you through omega 1 ck should suffice to show that any other natural class has a closure point of an admissible ordinal. How's that for a sketch of the proof?
I suspect there's non-terminal short games if you looked at those. Would give you the fact that this alpha n is.
Yeah, but that only works from this level and above.
I thought that was the question.
Well, I mean, there's sigma 0, 2 or some strange classes. Yeah, what I like about these kinds of games, or just sigma 0, 3 games, you know, player 2 can be asked to build a model of some theory, and player 1 is trying to show that model is ill-founded. So that'll get you up to some nice closure